So thank you very much indeed again for the time and generosity, Jane. I'm going to start with an introductory note about you, and then we'll start with the questions. You can correct me if there is something outdated in my introduction. Um,
Okay.
so, so Jane Anna Gordon is a professor of political science at University of Connecticut. She's a specialist in political theory with a focus on modern and contemporary political theory, Africana political thought, theories of enslavement, political theories of education, and methodologies in the social science. Gordon is most recently author of Creolizing Political Theory, reading Rousseau through Franz Fanon, 2014, and co-editor of Creolizing Rosa Luxemburg, 2021, and the Politics of Richard Wright, 2019, and the book that we are going to focus on today, the Statelessness and Contemporary Enslavement, I think was published in 2020. Jane, my first question is what prompted you to write about two subjects that are generally considered to be two different things? Personally, I was drawn to this book because I was curious to know why these two issues, namely enslavement and statelessness, are linked.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, and for the opportunity to speak with you. So I would answer in two ways. So the first is I actually began working on the two phenomena separately. So I first began working on statelessness when I had immediately completed my PhD, and I was actually invited to speak to the theme as a political theorist. And so Ramon Gross-Faguel was organizing a series of conferences together with Eric Mielence and Louis Gordon in France that were really focusing on theorizing the most important forms of political vulnerability. And so there was a conference on statelessness, there was a conference on global Blackness, there was a third that I'm not remembering the focus of. But with the statelessness one, as you know, most people who work on statelessness tend to work on it in two ways. Either they focus on particular instances of statelessness. They'll look at regions of the world where there are many stateless people and are often actively working to counteract the harms that come with statelessness. So they tend to be practitioners who are absolutely expert on particular instances of statelessness. That's one primary mode. And the second is really international lawyers who are trying to devise laws that are above the jurisdiction of states, and so can do better at helping people to navigate and move among states that really are propelled by domestic law. And so I took the assignment, because it really was an assignment, to speak about statelessness as a political theorist, as trying to sort of create a way of synthesizing conversations that otherwise would be discrete, and that often sort of coexisted in parallel without meeting. So conversations that weren't well coordinated, and not for lack of will, but just because there wasn't a sense of how the separate instances were actually connected. And so, as a very good student, I went and read everything that I could on statelessness and became interested in thinking about it as having three primary modes. Because one of the things that concerned me about the first way of thinking about statelessness was it tended to write about statelessness as if it was a separate phenomenon from colonization. And the reason why was that when many people thought about what statelessness did, the answer was that it pushed people outside of places of belonging. It pushed people outside of political units or states with nowhere to go because the world was already carved up into political units. But what struck me is there's another form of statelessness that's typically described by colonized people and by indigenous people. And that's actually a mode of being swallowed up. Right. So rather than being pushed out with nowhere to go, you're actually enveloped by state forms that you would never choose, that you would never assent to. But in many ways, your assent was treated as irrelevant. But it struck me that when they described what that form of statelessness produced, there were similarities and differences, but that they really were akin, because what formed out of being forced into states was that the units of belonging didn't map on to what it was that mattered most to the people who were being forcibly incorporated. And often within those states, they continued to be treated as people who didn't properly belong. So although they were territorially engulfed rather than pushed outside, if being instated is supposed to translate into a certain kind of existence and a certain kind of political life, it didn't happen there either. And so I was interested that there's sort of these two modes. One is being pushed out, the other is being pushed in, and that it's not as if we move neatly from one to the other, that they actually continue to coexist as forms of rendering people stateless. But the third kind that really interested me as well was that there's another form, I think, of generating de facto statelessness, which is that the only forms of citizenship that are available are ones that are emptied out of their meaningful content. And so if we think of citizenship as an achievement, it's because it creates options, it creates modes of existence that otherwise aren't there. But what happens when citizenship doesn't do that? But citizenship is the only way of thinking about belonging to a state. So then I sort of thought of a third form. So there's pushing out, there's forcibly in, but then there's also just eroding what it is that being the opposite of the stateless person is supposed to represent. And I thought in many ways, what you see in the 1990s, it continues very, very much now, that the stripping of meaningful social goods attached to citizenship means that the achievement of it has really been emptied out in many ways. And so I had been thinking about statelessness. What I happened to I was in a bookstore and I came upon a book by Kevin Bales called Disposable People. And it was a book about contemporary enslavement. And my responses to it were multiple and simultaneous, right? So on the one hand, I thought, wow, this is a phenomenon. I found it very convincing. I was convinced by his account that there are contemporary slaves, by the way he defined it, et cetera. Then I was embarrassed that I was surprised by his work and what it was revealing, because part of me thought, given what I know and given what I study, I shouldn't have responded to this as a surprise, even if it were sort of framed in a particularly compelling way. And then what I was surprised by was to learn that, as I wanted to learn more about enslavement, that many people absolutely reject calling anything contemporary enslavement. And so I became really fascinated by modes of denying contemporary enslavement as slavery by people who are very interested and concerned with forms of unfreedom. I mean, this was coming from progressive people, not from conservative or right-wing people. And so I became very interested in that. But I sort of began with one, encountered the other, but then in thinking about them simultaneously, realized how much they actually had in common. Both as phenomena in their own right, but also in the ways that people do and don't talk about them, right? So I'll say just a little bit about that. And so I began thinking about them in succession. I started with one and then went to the other. But what struck me as I began to think about them is how absolutely related they are, right? And you can talk about how they're related in many ways. So the first way that I thought about was that both of them are treated as radical exceptions and radical political failures that are supposed to be absolutely outside the norm, right? Most people assume that to be stateless is an exceptional condition, that most people are not stateless. Similarly, most people assume that if there is such thing as forced labor, surely it's marginal. Like when we talk about numbers or political salience, surely these are exceptional failures. They're not products of our systems. They're sort of failures to think through some of what our systems might generate. And what I found was the exact opposite, right? That both are absolutely inherent to the Euromodern world as it's been constructed, that states and statelessness were produced together. I mean, literally the construction of the modern nation state meant forcibly incorporating people who absolutely refused the entities into which they were being incorporated. And there are people being thrown out from the very beginning. And so states and statelessness were really built together. Similarly, with human enslavement, there are many debates about how to read the history of enslavement, because that history is very long. But the way that I read it, it's implicated most of the human species, right? And so I teach in a US university, and there are many African-descended people who've been told that enslavement is unique to their community. And there's a form of shame that comes with that. And one of the first things that I always say is there's no reason for that shame, because I can't think of a single human community that has been untouched by some form of enslavement. It really is a permanent feature of human history in some form, and it's very varied, and the variations matter, but it's absolutely central. I mean, the question is really what kind and how does it shift? And in many ways, I would flip it and say that what requires more explanation is when we're actually able to reduce it, because it's such a constant in human history. The second thing that both have in common is many people assume that we could fix these if we just expand existing mechanisms. You know, that if international law just has the reach that it should, or if immigration law or laws pertaining to sex work, it depends on how you understand what slavery is, or if labor laws were as they should be, that these things could be addressed. And one of the things that has become very clear to me is that that's absolutely not true, that the mechanisms that we have are not sufficient because they are premised upon ways of thinking about the relationship between territory and belonging and labor and belonging that simply don't work. And so there are many commonalities, and I'm going to wrap up so we can go to the next question because I know you have many more questions. But the last thing that I would just say that really surprised me in studying the two together is that I had said that many people are touched by enslavement and forced labor, and that is absolutely true. But one thing that is very different with racialization, very specifically, is that some people, when they're freed from slavery, they're able to distance themselves from the mark of that history, right? But it does seem that in the current political economic world, that if one belongs to a racialized community or colonized community, even with the formal ending of enslavement, one faces varieties of statelessness in the sense that even in the place that has always been your home, you are not treated as fully belonging. And so there's a way that people who are stateless are very vulnerable to literal enslavement, but people who have experienced literal enslavement, often even in its aftermath, experience statelessness.
Perfect. I mean, very interesting. You even answered partly my second question, but before going to the second question, there is I have a kind of spontaneous remark. Correct me if I'm wrong. That I mean, once I bought the book, I was thinking, what's the common thread between statelessness and enslavement, and I was thinking, perhaps belonging is a common thing between them. I mean, the lack of belonging. In one case, belonging and territory. In the other case, belonging and labor. Do you agree that belonging was also a drive in writing this book?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because my actual view is that anywhere that we labor, and I define labor very, very broadly. I mean, anywhere where we make a meaningful contribution to the good life of a place, we should be members and we should be treated as members. But most forms of enslavement and the multiple forms of guest work, there's so many ways of saying that we will take your labor, but we will not reward it with you belonging. That's what all varieties of unfree labor have in common, that people want the labor of a person, but they don't want their presence there to transform the place itself. And so the desire to extract labor without giving belonging is at the core of what enslavement is. So much so that even when enslavement is made illegal, all of the other regimes that are produced to replace it, that is what they have at their core. That you can labor, but you can never belong, right? I mean, that is the key insight. So yes, absolutely. And with statelessness, it's the same, right? Nobody chooses to be stateless. Nobody chooses to be a refugee. It's one of the most arduous conditions one can face. And it seems to me that the response to it is to offer opportunities to belong. But one of the reasons why I think it's important to see statelessness as both pushed out, pushed in, and eroded is that most of what produces statelessness are the states where those people actually begin their lives, right? So there are instances where you have forms of reorganization or islands that are enveloped by water. I mean, there are times where we haven't foreseen what somebody needs to be to have legal personhood. But in most instances, statelessness is created by states that do not want certain people to be part of who and what they are. And they would rather push them out into the most vulnerable of conditions than rethink who and what they are to incorporate those people. So yes, I absolutely see belonging and failures of belonging in our current political organization as the key things that statelessness and enslavement in common.
Right, great. So the second question that you partly answered is that what is wrong with treating the phenomenon of statelessness as a rare one or as an exceptional one, or framing it as a question faced only by refugees and other asylum seekers? I mean, what's wrong with, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
mm,
What's wrong with treating it as no? It's a
right,
fantastic question. I mean, what's wrong with treating it as exceptional is really two things that are related. When you treat it as exceptional, you assume that the systems that we have work, and that there are only some moments where they fail, the people and the aims that they're intended to address, right? And so some of treating it as exceptional is minimizing the scale of the problem and minimizing how much it reflects upon the states that generate statelessness. So saying that it's not exceptional is to say that statelessness is inherent to the system that we have. It's not a side issue that can be fixed in a more minimal way. So at one level, it's just treating it with the dignity that it deserves in terms of the scale and the kind of problem that it is. It's fundamental, not aberrational. But the other is that then it poses the question, why is it that statelessness is so endemic? And if it is so endemic, what does it say about our current state structures? Because if part of what they do is to generate statelessness, it means that there's something fundamentally wrong in the way that we've thought about states, and how they relate to questions of belonging, especially given movement. And I do think also that part of the reason that we tend to treat statelessness as so exceptional is there's a commitment to the idea that the Euro-modern nation state is the highest political form, that it's the last political form, that there's nothing beyond it. And so once you've taken that position that what we have is the best that there can be, you want to minimize its outrages and its failures, right? But if you say, oh, no, 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 this is rendering people vulnerable in its very construction, then you need to think beyond it. And so part of the reason that I'm trying to think from very particular instances, but also to link up the particular instances, is that's how you show that something's systemic rather than exceptional. Because if we say that states are generating statelessness, then we need a new form of political organization that makes people members with what membership should supply.
great, thank you. Um, this question might sound a bit basic. You also mentioned this. I mean, you claim that statelessness refers to the elastic zone of eroded political membership within a state, the effects of which are sometimes visible and intended, but often implicit and a consequence of the Euro-modern state. Why is it linked, Jane, to the Euro-modern state? I mean, it's a very basic question, but why this kind of statelessness is really you mentioned it from the beginning in the book, even talking about slavery. Uh, how do you link it to Euro modern state? I mean, very
Sure.
basic question.
Yeah, no. It's an excellent question. So part of it is that if you think of any instance where you're crafting something, right? There's an ideal that inspires the crafting, and a sort of ideal image that one's going for. And one of the things about the Euro modern nation state in particular is it really aimed to map isomorphically a territory onto a people. And the people was always treated as far more homogenous than it actually was, and as far more ideal than it actually was. And so a lot of state craftsmanship, and it really is craftsmanship as opposed to crafthumanship, is about trying to create a narcissistic image of what a state should embody. And that means driving people out, that means hiding people within, but it also means masking the relations of constitution of those very states, right? So you can think, for instance, of the obsession of continental Europe with distancing itself from its colonies, that what went on in the colonies supposedly never went on in continental Europe, as if that made continental Europe somehow free of all of what it was doing in its colonies. So I'm thinking about the idea in France, say, that, you're free the minute your foot touches French soil. But French soil also includes all of the Francophone territories where people are experiencing absolutely brutal dehumanization and enslavement, right? And so some of this it's a desire to create a an unrealistic, perfect image of the nation as mapped onto the territory. And what you do with the people who embody the contradictions is treat them with extreme cruelty, whether it's literally throwing them out, whether it's treating them as if they're not there. But it's to, whenever we try to impose these kinds of ideals onto the much, much messier realities of human life, it produces all kinds of violence. And the Euro modern nation state is about imposing, I think, a very bankrupt ideal onto a political world and then trying to erase and destroy the contradictions. And the contradictions are human beings.
Wonderful, thank you. Then next question is that, I mean, I have this question not only when it comes to enslavement, I have this question in general when it comes to other big issues like violence, like discrimination, like racism. But let's stick to the question, are we witnessing something else today, or are we simply seeing a phenomena with continuous and discrete forms? I mean, precisely, I mean, in relation between old and transatlantic slavery and contemporary one. You say that, I'm quoting you, as with statelessness, enslavement historically and in the present is not a radical exception. Indeed, enslavement is such a constant feature of human history, one that implicated so much of our species, that it is its eradication or relative transformation that requires explanation. End of quote. You mentioned that, I mean, even in the earlier answer to my question, but I mean, as I told you, I have this. I'm curious when it comes, for example, when it comes to violence. You know, like, are we really over it? We have less violent world, or we are being manipulated with new forms of violence. You know,
Yeah.
how is it when it comes to slavery?
Yeah. So with slavery, I do think that it's important to stress both, right? Both that it's very continuous with forms that have been around for a very long time, and that there are new dimensions simply because enslavement is many things, but it's primarily a political economic institution. And so there are ways in which it mirrors the changed conditions within which it takes place, right? So I think, I mean, there are things that are absolutely constant. The aim of one human being to own another, and to act with absolute unilateralism. And for that person to lack their own independent standing in relationship to the polity in which they live, the treating of their own kin as if they're absolutely irrelevant, because that would muddy what it is that can be demanded of them. Those things are constants. They've been true throughout human history. But the kinds of things that have changed are the legal environment and the capitalist environment, right? So the legal environment is that if there are places in which we claim that slavery is an evil that we've banished from humankind, even though it continues to exist, that's a different, so it'll produce different outcomes, right? So for instance, if you have to hide a practice that's actually continuous, you engage in it differently. It's more dangerous for the people implicated, actually, when it continues as illegal than when it's legal. And similarly, our relationship to commodities have changed. So if under capitalist conditions, a slave is a commodity, then the value of commodities will also affect the human being as commodity, right? So just as commodities have really diminished in value, enslaved people have diminished in their, say, the price of purchasing an enslaved person. And so there's this combination of the old and the new. So I think the damages done are very old. I don't think there's much that's new about them. And the people who are vulnerable to that form of damage are also remarkably consistent. But the way that the damage looks in economic terms has shifted some. So for instance, people can buy an enslaved person for $50, right? And will typically, as is true with many forms of labor, right? It's sort of varied, it's connected to other forms of labor in very disparate and disjointed ways. That when an enslaved person becomes old or sick, you just sort of chuck them out, just as you would, you know, a machine now that used to be So there's sort of a combination of new and old, but I think the relation at the core is remarkably similar. But the political economic conditions and sort of the context for it have shifted in ways that make it hard at first to
Right,
recognize. But that what's going on and the damage done and why it's a problem has not changed.
right, all right, okay, okay, see.
And the one
Uh-huh.
thing I would just add too, because it connects to your earlier question, is that, I mean, one could say, well, what's the big deal with taking somebody's labor and not allowing them political membership? Like, why is that a problem, right? It's like it's a good question to ask. But one of them, and the same goes for the stateless. You know, why is it a problem if somebody sort of allowed physical residence that they can't actually belong as a member? Right. And the answer is that you don't get to hear what they would say about the situation that they're in. I mean, that part of being able to treat those things as exceptional again is not hearing the political voices of the people who are implicated. Because if you do, it forces a whole other set of questions. And so it's not an accident that people like Aristotle spent so much time claiming that enslaved people couldn't think in their own right. It would have been terrifying to hear what they thought in their own right,
Mm,
and it would have
mm,
really challenged the acceptability of what was being treated as if it were okay.
interesting. In different parts of the book, you mentioned the writer Eric Williams. You quote him in your book as saying that, I'm quoting you, slavery was not, or quoting him, slavery was not born of racism, but racism was a consequence of slavery, end of quote. Um,
Yeah.
um, what is the, I mean, I mean, through this question, I want to ask,
Mm.
what is the role of post-colonial studies or people like Franz Fanon in your research of the book?
It's a terrific question. So I would say a couple of things. I mean, in all of my work, I'm really guided by Caribbean political thought in its full variety. And part of that is because I think the Caribbean, like statelessness and like enslavement, has often been treated as exceptional, as if it's sort of this region of the world that's very different, that's interesting, but so small that it's not deserving of real theoretical attention. But one of the things that was so interesting about the Caribbean is it's really a meeting point of so much of the globe. I mean, the globe meets in the Caribbean. And so it's always been a place from which people are trying to understand the global, and also facets of relationships that are often rendered invisible. And so, for instance, if you look at Europe from the Caribbean, Europe looks very, very different than if you look at the globe from Europe. And so I think as sort of a place to think about global phenomena, the Caribbean has always been an incredibly helpful perch from which to look at the world. And what I would say about Eric Williams and Fanon is they both argue that it's impossible for one place to gather its sustenance unilaterally from another place without blaming the place that's being exploited and extracted from their exploitation and their extraction. So, for instance, Fanon argued France could not have the relationship it did to Algeria without blaming the Algerians for their subordination. Um, and so the argument is you can never dehumanize, exploit, etc., without suggesting that the people who are the subjects of exploitation deserve it, right? And I think that that argument is absolutely true, right? So, for instance, in the US, we have astronomical rates of incarceration of people. And that can't happen without people sort of blaming the incarcerated for their incarceration. And so there's an active abolitionist movement, but by the time you point out that the people who are incarcerated are not deserving of incarceration, you're propelled to do something. You have to change it. Whereas if you're committed to treating it as normal, the move is almost always to blame the people who are victimized for their victimization. Right. And so Eric Williams was making the same point. His argument was that you can, of course, you can observe human difference, but that's very different from racialization. Racialization is what comes when you're trying to justify your subordination and dependence upon the subordination of another group of people. And so I think their work runs through mine because my point, what I'm arguing is that unless you're absolutely committed to transforming those relationships, the only way you can normalize them is by depoliticizing them through blaming people for the hardships that they face.
Yeah, great. Thank you. My next question is a bit long. I hope you have the patience to hear that.
Okay,
So,
I have a pen, so I can write.
so I mean, sometimes it's not a question. It's like something that they want to hear your idea about. I mean, it's perhaps
Yeah.
not really a question. So many people in Europe and North America assume that slavery ended when it was outlawed in the countries of those continents in the 19th century, and that there is a clear consensus that our norms regarding it have followed the legal side against it. But if no one would openly support people, sorry, just I forgot to say it's a quote from the book, yeah. So
Yeah.
that's a quote from you, but you continue to say that if no one would openly support people being forced to work unpaid against their will, many people will and do support constellations of policies and political orientations that had that consequence. End of quote. It's interesting. It was interesting for me that even here there is a myopic view that what I'm doing is not openly advocating slavery, and that's enough. As an
Yeah.
example, you cite a clear correlation between neoliberal economic policies introduced in the 1990s and the proliferation of protectorate wars and the increase in the number of enslaved people. Uh, so again, that's not really a question, but I see that it's interesting for me that I mean I was reading a book. I even interviewed the scholar Marin Kaldor. She has written about old and new wars, and there you
Mm.
see that what is I mean in her argument is that uh, if the old wars were based on winnability and like killing the enemy and so on and so forth or conquering, the new wars are based on displacement, and as a result we have a lot of refugees, we have a lot of people who are stateless, we have a lot of people who move, right? So in the new
Mhm.
wars, like what is happening now, like the new war, like Russia, Ukraine, yeah. So it's, I mean, in her opinion, that's a kind of new war that we're witnessing. What's interesting for me in relation to your work is that um, it's like they are like you try to sort of have this bigger view of like, okay, neoliberal economy, war, refugees, stateless people, and
Yeah.
uh, and it's not only that, okay, it's been outlawed and we don't have any slavery anymore. And so that's as I told you, that's interesting that apparently that's a myopic view that okay, I'm not openly advocating it. I'm not
Mm.
openly advocating slavery, and it's all good. There is no more slavery in the world here. You don't even think of sweatshops. You don't even think of prisons. As two examples, even two paradigms of new forms of enslavement. So again, it was not a question; it was perhaps a kind of reading
No,
something
no,
that I
but I
found.
but I think you're exactly right, and it connects back to what we were talking about earlier about why it is that the nation state can be so damaging, right?
Mhm,
Is that there's such a desire to say that we've experienced and embodied moral progress,
mhm,
that we say, none of us endorse slavery, and of course it's outlawed and it's gone. But what happens given that there's loads of actual slaves? Then, I mean, the next question would be, well, what's generating their existence if we claim to have eradicated this phenomenon, and if we claim that we don't actually support it? But what's interesting is if you look at the development of histories like guest worker programs, they were very explicitly sold to the people who advocated for them as the next best thing to enslavement, sort of a less cruel enslavement. And similarly, wage labor. I mean, the idea was that the physical dimensions of harm and cruelty would recede, and that economic forces themselves would sort of do the do the injurious work of making people have to work. But it's interesting that when you look at things like global supply chains, they so deliberately defer responsibility. I mean, their very structure is designed so that you can never quite point to who has done a wrong or who has underpaid the relevant person. I mean, they're in their very design deferrals of responsibility. But if that's the case, we need to ask the next question. It's why do you have to defer that responsibility? right? And so there's a real commitment to masking rather than seeing, naming, and addressing. But at the same time, treating the mask itself as a moral achievement. But what that masking actually does is to intensify vulnerability, because you can't see it, you can't name it, there are no mechanisms for responding to it. And it's all for the sake of being able to make a moral claim of being the culmination of human history, right? But the thing that I find interesting is, because it is bad faith, right? It's a hiding from responsibility and a hiding from truth. The contradictions emerge with regularity. So, for instance, I mean, on the political right, everywhere, right? But I'm most familiar with the specific policies in the United States. There's increasingly an argument that if school children are poor and need to receive school lunches, that they should have to work for them. And how is that not child labor? Right. And there are many people who are arguing for the eradication of child labor laws. I mean, laws that were designed to assure that a child had to prioritize their own education over working. There are many explicit arguments for the erosion of that. And similarly, there's a very open support for incarcerated people not being paid the minimum wage. So sort of an active effort to assure that the place of the prison is outside of the reach of law that we've all decided people actually deserve. And so I do think the sort of the bad faith that follows is really important to understand, because it creates a much murkier political terrain. But there's so much invested in this, in saying, you know, that there's certain places and people that have achieved these moral, you know, outcomes. But they're based in lies, and lies that intensify actual human suffering.
Mhm. Thank you. Let's move on to neoliberalism and contract slavery that you talk about in the book. As you put it, I'm quoting you: contract slavery arises in almost every case where people desperate for better living conditions for themselves and their children enter into misleading arrangements. In some cases, children are taken from rural areas to cities with the promise of schooling that ends in domestic servitude. In other cases, people move from less prosperous to more prosperous areas within the same region. So my question is about this deception that is happening there. Is it something new in the new forms of especially wage slavery? And can we see it also in the old forms of slavery in contrast to their brutality and I mean, especially brutality in the war slavery? Especially because somewhere towards the end of the book, you add that, again, I'm quoting you: enslavement always involves the central use of deception and manipulation combined with threats and actual physical violence, which can be present where people are fundamentally underpaid from their labors.
Yeah. So I do think that the deception in terms of conditions people. So there's the history of human migration is very, very long, and I think one of the greatest errors that we make in telling, you know, sort of long histories of human beings is to treat migration similarly as exceptional or new, or, you know, to downplay its scale and how continuous it is. And when people have needed other people to travel or to navigate closed borders, there have always been modes of exchange that are unprotected. And because they're unprotected, the people who are helping others to navigate those closed terrains can be exploitative. I mean, that's not new. But I do think what is new is the scale of migration and the composition of migrants, right? So I mean, you know this far better than I do, right? That the numbers of people who are being driven out of the places that they've considered home due to either ongoing civil wars or governments that treat themselves as if they're at war with their people, or legacies of colonialism that make some economies simply extract from other economies to such an extent that they become unlivable places. So the forces propelling movement have, I think, intensified, and many of the people who are moving are women and children. I mean, for a long time, when people migrated, it was men on their own, and so a lot of the mechanisms that we have still assume that it's single men who are traveling, when it's often families or women or children or unaccompanied children. So the migrants themselves have definitely shifted. But I do think the other thing is that there's a harshness to how people who need to leave, who need to flee, are treated. And so one of the responses to a world that is getting increasingly smaller and where borders are increasingly porous is for many states to really try to close their borders even more firmly than they ever did. But what's interesting is when they close them, it reflects their nation state policies, right? They're always open to some people, but they're firmly closed to the vast majority of people who need them to be most open. And that creates real opportunities in a brutal capitalist economy for growth, for the growth of exploitation out of that very situation, right? And so I do think that exploitative forms of kind of people needing to move and being able to extract all kinds of things from them and deceive them in all kinds of ways, that the nature of that has proliferated, I think, just because the earth is smaller, people learn from each other, et cetera. So I do think that that has really proliferated. But the other thing that I do think is that in the past, it was a very familiar story to make oneself indebted to be able to travel, right? And so one would often work sometimes for half a generation to pay back that debt. But at the end of it, the indebtedness was over. But one of the things about the contemporary economy is there's very little regulation of indebtedness, right? And so you can pay and pay and pay and pay and never get rid of your debt. And that's true in so many different parts of the economy, but I think that has everything to do with the degree and harshness of the deception of the contract slave. That there are no mechanisms in place to say the debt has been paid. And I think some of that is that in many, I mean, in the political culture of the United States, you never pay your debts, right? Incarcerated people can never actually rebuild their lives because the sentence itself is never actually paid. Even if one's been behind bars, at the end of it, it's not a clean slate. You haven't done your, you haven't cleared your debt. And so I think at the level of political thinking, but also in terms of mechanisms, we haven't figured out how to actually say a debt has been paid. But indenture, which was a finite servitude, was absolutely reliant on those mechanisms, and they're gone. And so many people absolutely assume that they're pledging themselves against a debt, and that after they labor a certain point, the debts are cleared, right? That they've done their work. But when those mechanisms are gone, what do you have? An extreme murkiness that is connected to servitude.
So you see that indebtedness is somehow being proliferated in the new form of economy. I mean, you said that, in the book, you say that the main mode of acquiring slaves today is through indebtedness, or where an inability to repay requires pledging oneself as indefinite compensation. We should remember in this context that in much classical political theory, democracy emerges not when forcefully instituted by outside militaries or financial corporations, as has become familiar in the late 20th and early 21st century, but when the slaves unite and overthrow their masters, demanding the eradication of their extensive debts, end of quote. So the implication is really revolutionary here. It's like
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
To make revolution possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
One.
Because if you think of one of the biggest barriers to political protest and political participation is economic indebtedness, right? I mean, the number of people who are working constantly to try to not eliminate, because that's not even on the horizon often, but to limit their indebtedness. And the similar with imprisoned people, right? The view is you owe a debt to society. And even when you've done time, you can't actually clear yourself of it. And so part of, I mean, the history of democratic thinking is rethinking the nature of indebtedness and saying, you know, maybe we're not calling the right debts. So for instance, why is colonialism not the most profound form of indebtedness to the colonies, right? I mean, that seems like a form of indebtedness that's worth talking about. Not people who are accruing massive debt to pay for educations that should be publicly funded. But when people feel that they're indebted, it's very, very difficult to be a revolutionary.
Right. Interesting. Very interesting. So the classic book from Kevin Bales you talk about, and you even talked about right now. I mean, in his book, Thailand is the best example of the new slavery of prostitution. In his example, prostitutes are taken from consenting parents at a very young age for the price of a television set. And after being taken to the cities, they are beaten into submission or often raped if they refuse to consent to sex. I'm using this example from his book to get to your point in the book about consent and to see what is wrong with the concept of consent from your point of view. Using Carol Pottman as a starting point, you explain in the you explain about the tragic career of consent. So what is that and why is it important in your research?
Sure. So I actually wrote this part of the book when I was participating in a year-long seminar focused on the question of consent. And the participants in it were brilliant people, very erudite, and they spent a lot of time talking about everything that was wrong with consent. And I agreed with many of the things that they said. And those were things like many of the mechanisms we have for consent are quite empty, that there has to, that if consent is meaningful, there has to be an alternative to it. Like you have to be able to not consent and still be able to live, for instance. So some of them were about how much liberal economics has dominated the thinking of consent, and that one of the things about the contract as the model of consent is it decontextualizes decisions from larger webs that always complicate that moment of transaction. And it treats as transactions things that shouldn't be transactions at all. It was sort of those kinds of criticisms. And then there was another kind of more psychoanalytical read that said that sort of consent assumes that we're much more transparent to ourselves than we actually are, that most of us are highly ambivalent. We don't always know what we want, you know, this kind of thing, and that it makes consent in any kind of clear way, they thought, too simplistic. But at the same time as all of those arguments were being made, I was thinking about what enslaved people say about what's wrong with enslavement, and what people who've been raped say about what's wrong with rape, and what people who say, you know, the colonization is wrong say. I mean, and the whole point with all of those things is that the person who's implicated is treated as if they're not a human being with a point of view and desires and lack of desires. And so I think treating consent as if it's irrelevant or a fiction is really dangerous unless we have a better alternative. And so my argument basically is that I do think that the choices that matter most are not one-time transactions, right? They're about constituting the field within which other decisions are made. But in many ways, I think that social movements, progressive social movements, are enacting an alternative conception of consent in the sense that they're saying that they're refusing certain things, but they're always refusing them in the name of a different kind of order. And so a more meaningful consent is one that's not about individual items in a political program. It's about a constellation of a vision that guides and underpins what it is that we're seeking. But the idea that are not being able to weigh in meaningfully about what matters most to us, we can't write off ways of creating opportunities for people to engage in that kind of deliberation. That makes no sense. There's no politics without people being able to meaningfully weigh in about what matters most. And consent in some versions makes that seem like a much smaller thing, a yes or a no. But the truth is, the origins of discussions about consent were about seeing people who've been written out of the political sphere as actual political subjects, that servants should also be political subjects, that enslaved people should also be political subjects. It was about expanding the reference of wills that were relevant. And that project I'm completely sympathetic with. It's just an unfinished one.
it's very interesting. It's really fabulous what you said. I mean, like it sort of makes me think of the relation between consent and deception, because I mean, actually,
Mhm.
deception takes place when your consent is rooted only through the focus, through your focus on one single item.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yep.
deception happens when you see
Yeah.
one item, you don't see the whole
Yeah.
system, you don't see the whole
Absolutely.
constellation.
And it's dangerous because the thing that it does is it makes you seemingly consent to something that you would never consent to, which
Right.
makes what follows so much more dangerous. And it's what opens up the room for things like shame, because you
Mhm.
blame yourself for your own complicitness in what it is
Exactly.
that you're then
Right.
facing. But it's
Right.
right. Your focus, I mean, what deception does is makes you decontextualize one dimension of a situation from all of the others. And
Mhm.
so that it's seen in a kind of, it's magnified while everything else recedes from view. But everything else needs to not recede from view if
Mhm.
you're going to not be deceived in making a choice.
Yeah, I hear this argument. It's very interesting, Jane. I hear this argument when it comes to Iraq, when it comes to Libya, that people they wanted that U.S. Attacks or like the drones, the dictators there, and so on and so forth. I mean, again, this consent. I mean, like how like, and then you see that you read a lot about Iraqis now or the people in Libya that what's been happened after the war is way
Mhm.
more horrible, I mean, than what was taking place there. I mean, I'm not justifying any kind of like tyranny or dictatorship, but the thing is that in the geopolitical sense of the word, deception happens very brutally and it's very dangerous. Like people think that,
Yes.
okay, they are going to liberate us, they are going to liberate our women, for example, in Iran. Yeah. And then you see that
Mhm.
no, they will increase sanctions, they will invade the country, they will wage war.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But
Mhm.
here's the thing is if there wasn't deception, what they would do would be more physically cruel. But in some ways, the deception makes the feat on the easier and also so much more difficult to bear, because then the people who were deceived are blaming themselves and turning
Mhm.
on one another as much as they are looking at the person who engaged in the deception.
Absolutely, absolutely. As I
And I think
told
the
you,
people who are doing the deceiving deceive themselves as well. I really
I,
do. I mean, I'm absolutely convinced that US people think that they're saving the world's women, right? I mean, that's a discourse that runs incredibly deep. It's completely deceptive.
Mhm, 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 mhm. Interesting. Interesting and sad. So I have two questions left, I think. I
Okay.
hope we have the time. So, um, Giorgio Agamben argues that the current situation is a catastrophe and suggests that we should no longer engage in what he calls infinite negotiations focused on citizenship and rights. Instead, Agamben calls for a radical break in the name of what he calls a non-statal and non-juridical politics and human life. In contrast, people like the scholar that you also quote in the book, Aytin Gunukdu, I think, proposes a critique that draws attention to the potential of challenging the state of being without rights by navigating and reshaping the complexities of human rights. So, what people like Agamben dismiss, according to her, is a never is that they can actually they dismiss the transformative new beginnings and reshaping existing legal frameworks. Um, what is the point of recognizing? My question is, what is the point of recognizing? I mean, through polarizing these two scholars, or highlighting them, or exaggerating their positions, what is the point of recognizing the agency and political practices of stateless people in their struggle for equal rights in a world where, as Carol Patman would say, consent can be coerced or manipulated because of the power differentials.
Mm. So, I mean, so one of the reasons that I to go back to your early question that I put together statelessness and enslaved people is I think that looking at the organization of the political world from the vantage point of the enslaved person and the stateless person offers an incredibly useful mirror and window into thinking about kinds of alternatives. And I'm not sure that I know what all of those alternatives are, but I think one of the obligations that follows from treating statelessness and enslavement as endemic rather than aberrational is that their question should be treated as the central challenges of our political order, rather than sort of some people who are facing difficulties and are separate from the state itself, that there's a tendency to externalize those issues rather than treating them as central. And so there are many people who've responded to the dilemmas that I also study, and have taken an anti-statist position of the kind that you described with Agamben, who said, states have been predatory, states have been rapacious, states generate vulnerability rather than reducing it. So let's be done with them. And I'm very sympathetic to that argument. I think the Euro-modern nation state has done, unprecedented forms of damage to the globe and to the earth, actually. But I think it's a mistake to treat that model as monopolizing all that we can do with state forms and political institutions. And so I know many of my indigenous and Black anarchist colleagues say that the state form is intrinsically terrible, that it's arisen with colonialism, that's embedded in its very structure, that it can't be separated from those things. And that may be true, but the trouble that I have is that there's a tendency on the anarchist left to treat political institutions we like as non-states and treat political institutions we don't like as states. And so, in other words, if something's bad, it's a state, and if something's good, it's somehow something alternative to a state. And there's part of me that looks at moments of policies and institutions that states have built that have absolutely expanded freedom, and have improved the quality of human life. And so whether I see states as having been captured and monopolized by a Euro-Christian capitalist model. That's how I understand the history of states. And I think there were states before that model, and I think that there'll be states after that. But at the same time, in some ways, it's more important to me to have comrades and collaborators among the anti-statists. So if we have to call them political institutions instead, fine. But there's no way in a world like ours to not have coordinating political institutions. We need them. We need them for the infrastructure of human lives. But it's clear that the forms that we have are completely outmoded. They do not work. And there's so many levels at which they don't work for people who are stateless and for people who are instated. And so it's clear that we need alternatives, but that the shape of those alternatives should be informed very directly by the worst forms of vulnerability our current system produces. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the stateless and the enslaved.
Okay, interesting.
And one thing just to add to that is,
oh, sorry. Please.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that one of the key questions is that one of the biggest problems of Euro-modern nation states is they're committed to not thinking relationally when they see the globe. So, for instance, the idea that you separate nation states from the colonies from which they draw their sustenance, that's a very misleading way of thinking the globe. But one of the things about stateless people is stateless people traverse the globe. Enslaved people traverse the globe. There are different ways of understanding the globe that we see when we make visible people who've been deliberately invisibilized. And so that's part of why I say that as well. It's not about some kind of intrinsic experience. It's about the actual experience of navigating a globe.
Sure. All right. Okay. So I have two questions, but the first one is kind of it's very interesting, like the difference made between work and labor in a language that you analyze in the conclusion to the book. Citizenship language explored by Komarov's is a very interesting one. In their language, as you said, they make a difference between godira as associated with making and doing and causing to happen, like cooking, cultivating, and creating a family or performing a ritual, which is a process rather than event. And on the other hand, bereka, which is similar to labor, where meaningful relations to life were overshadowed as the labor was alienated from fellowship with kith and kin. As you say, wage labor brought by white colonialists is an example of Bereka. My question is, let's say my last question is
Okay.
how much is I don't want to take more time. So my question is how much this opposition, this beautifully depicted opposition in that language is relevant and helpful and useful to our understanding of work in capitalist societies.
Terrific. Thank you for the question. And I would just say that my thinking on this question is also fundamentally informed by one of my doctoral students who's a student in philosophy who's working on work, the philosophy of work. And what's interesting is she's been grappling with a lot of the debates in post-work scholarship, which essentially argue that we're at a point in human organization where most people don't need to spend as much time as they do laboring for a wage, that we could produce what it is that everybody needs with much more limited labor time. And the question is distribution, right? And she's sympathetic to all of the arguments about alienated labor, but she thinks that there's a mistake in treating alienated labor as synonymous with work, that work is a much broader category of all of the kinds of intentional activity, effortful activity that we engage in to build human worlds. So for instance, from her point of view, labor organizing is work, right? Creating human relations of solidarity is work. And so to treat all work as if it's the alienated stuff of capitalist labor is to misunderstand how we can build an alternative to it. That we need to continue to value human endeavor as a form of work that's not completely monopolized by the need to labor to live. And I think she's absolutely right that if we're going to build alternative kinds of institutions, systems that aren't fundamentally broken, we need an understanding of work as connective. And part of the reason that I ended there is I think one of the biggest problems with most of our political institutions is they sever all kinds of relationships that need to be remembered, and that work is really the model for how to do that.
Right. Right. Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Jane.